There we go. All right, my friends. So we will jump back in. This is chapter 39 of Genesis. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at that completely random chapter of 38, the story of Tamar. Strange tale, and really, as we said at the time, it's a side trip. Before and after is the story of Joseph, and there's no connection at all, other than sort of a previously in Canaan kind of stuff, I guess. But now we return to that story of Joseph, who was last seen being sold into Egypt, right? He was sold to the Ishmaelites and sent off on his way. His dad thinks he's dead, and they're all done with the dreamer. So with that in mind, we get to 39. Now, when Joseph was brought down to Egypt, Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh and chief of the guard, an Egyptian man, acquired him from the hands of the Ishmaelites, who brought him down there. But the Lord was with Joseph, so that he became a man of success. While he was in the house of his lord, the Egyptian, his lord saw that the Lord was with him, so that whatever he did, the Lord made him succeed in his hands. Or made success, I guess. That's weird. Made succeed in his hands. I think it should be success. Made success in his hands. Joseph found favor in his eyes, and he waited upon him. He appointed him over his house, and everything belonging to him he placed in his hands. And it was from when he had been appointed, and when he had appointed him over his house and over everything that belonged to him, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was upon everything that belonged to him in the house and in the fields. So he left everything that was in Joseph's hands, not concerning himself about anything with him there, except for the bread that he ate. Now Joseph was fair of form and fair to look at. All right, so we see Joseph quickly makes himself indispensable, right? We also note that Joseph is beautiful. This seems to be, as Brueggemann notes, this seems to be a family trait. Rachel and Sarah and all these others are described as exceptionally attractive, and we can say that they're blessed physically on some level. We don't get anything more than that. Just he was a beautiful young man. At this point, 17 or 18 years old, something like that, from what we learned in the previous chapter. So a young man and evidently a good-looking one is all we really know. But here's what we do know overall: Joseph is also blessed by God to succeed, right? We know the dream. We know that there's going to be bigger things going on. So it shouldn't be surprising that as soon as he gets there, he becomes this exceptional character, just like his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, right? Anywhere they go, God blesses them, and they immediately are financially blessed as well as they are anything else. So both Freetham and Brueggemann note that we now see how we now will see how operates how dreams operate versus empire and imperial power, right? Like they both see this as this sort of battle, like who is going to win in this contest, or what's going to happen between the two. But I don't think either of them get it fully right. That is, they don't label the story for what it is. And when Brueggemann wrote the book, I mean, he wrote his book, 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Freetham the same. In both cases, this wasn't really a term that was used too much, but I'm seeing more and more research and scholarship about it now. It's what would be called a resistance narrative or resistance storytelling. Now, what does that mean? Resistance storytelling is all about people in a situation that are at the bottom of the economic or rung or the bottom of the empire, telling truth to the empire, telling their story about how the empire has oppressed them or dealt with them wrongly in a variety of ways, right? So resistance narrative is that sort of idea, or resistance literature is the larger sort of brand name of this kind of idea. So I'm going to talk about that for a little. So the stories of resistance work differently, right? So it's certainly a question of empire or power versus the oppressed and powerless. That they would agree with. The resistance narrative would agree with that, which Brueggemann and Freetham are right to note. But it's also a reminder that the empire has all the power. all that can be done is subtle forms of resistance and rejection. In other words, we like to have these big stories like Gandhi or King where they rise up and throw off the shackles, or even in Exodus, right, where Moses appears and thanks to God's hand, they're able to throw off the most powerful empire in the world. But really what we're dealing with here is one man versus the empire. Nothing he does can overcome the empire, not by himself. So resistance narrative then is, what's the story of that being a one person or a small group within a much larger situation? How does that work? And how do you live a life that is authentic to who you are, but also realizes that everything is stacked against you, right? So Joseph, despite his blessedness, is a slave. We have to name that first in a resistance narrative. He is a slave. He doesn't have any authority. And you read this through the lens of empire, then Joseph is one heck of a businessman and an incredible asset to the empire, right? Which is how it often gets read. But, and Potiphar's lucky to have him, right? That's how we would read it, through that lens of empire and authority and control. But if you read this as a resistance narrative, then Joseph knows how to play the games of empire. He knows better than the empire how things work. He knows better than his master what the empire is and how he has to use it, right? He proves himself to be a smooth operator within the empire, despite being someone outside of the empire. And ultimately, then, it's a critique of Potiphar and the entire empire, right? Potiphar doesn't actually really know how to run his business. Joseph does it for him. All he does is sit back, and he doesn't really have an idea of what's going on, which then sets the stage for what happens next. Potiphar doesn't know what's going on. Should we be surprised he doesn't know that his wife and his leader are getting caught in mischief, right? It's all this subtle critique of, well, oh, the empire thinks it knows what's going on, but the empire has no idea what's actually going on, right? How the machinations of the machine really work. It is an affirmation that God is on Joseph's side and not the empire's. It's absolutely that, but it has this subtle and much more intentional critique of everything that's going on that we should be hearing. But again, we tend to read it as empire because that's who we are. That's where we are, right? We are part of empire now. And so we don't always hear these stories, I think, the way they were intended, which is much more as a full-fledged critique of Egypt, critique of Potiphar, critique of the wife, critique of the whole system, right? I wanted to start that before we get into the story itself, because it is a big idea. Thoughts on that concept of resistance narrative, of how that might work? We're all buying in, huh? Good. Okay. So then the story, right? Now, after these events, it was that his Lord's wife fixed her eyes upon Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. He said to his Lord's wife, "Look, my Lord need not concern himself with anything in the house. With me here and everything that belongs to him, he has placed in my hands. He is no greater in this house than I, and has withheld nothing from me except for yourself, since you are his wife. So how could I do this great ill? I would be sinning against God." Now it was, as she would speak to Joseph day after day, that he would not hearken to her, to lie beside her, to be with her. So it was on such a day, when he came into the house to do his work, and none of the house people was there in the house, that she grabbed him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled, escaping outside. Now it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, that she called in her house people and said to them, "See, he has brought to us a Hebrew man to play around with us. He came to me to lie with me, but I called out with a loud voice. And it was when he heard that I lifted up my voice and called out, that he left his garment beside me and fled, escaping outside. Now she kept his garment beside her until his Lord came back to the house. And then she spoke to him according to these words, saying, "There came to me the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us to play around with me. But it was when I lifted up my voice and called out, that he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Now it was when his Lord heard his wife's words, which she spoke to him, saying, according to these words, your servant did to me, that his anger flared up. Joseph's Lord took him and put him in the dungeon house in the place where the king's prisoners are imprisoned. But while he was there in the dungeon house, I accidentally bumped 22 and 23. Let me pull that up. Now it was in the 20, let's see, in 20, while Joseph was there in the prison. Oh, that's okay. That's just the next section. Sorry. I should have cut the end of 20. So it just has to be in the place where the prisoners were imprisoned, right? So Brueggemann notes that this story is similar to the story of two brothers, an Egyptian tale from the late Bronze period. The same is true for many of the stories in the Old Testament. Noah is similar to the tale of Gilgamesh. There's lots of flood stories in Babylon and Syria. There's a whole book called Old Testament Parallels that shows all of these stories. It's a fascinating book if you ever want to pick it up and read it. People get very anxious about this idea that the stories in the Bible have antecedents around the Near East. This happens all the time in all kinds of ways and shapes and forms. What's important is not that there are parallels, it's to see how they're different, right? Because what's different in this is that Joseph has God on his side versus the empire, versus that story of the two brothers where it's more of just a whole conversation about whose wife and all these kinds of other things going on, right? And that reversal. It's not, and this is true for the story of Gilgamesh, right? God is the one who chooses to flood the earth, but then he also chooses to save the earth through that work of Noah. And people get worried about this. There's nothing to get worried about. It's just the reality that it happened. No one, to my knowledge, has done one for New Testament, but there are stories in the New Testament that they're pretty sure have been similarly adapted. If you're paying attention, at one point, we say it all the time, right? Paul will say in him it says it very subtly, right? As they say, in him we live and move and have our being. Most people have reconciled that as a quote from one of the poets of Greece. But it's been used by Paul to obviously refer to Jesus and have a whole idea of how we are related and in relationship with God and through Christ. People do it all the time. It's like it's actually just about like every one of John Porter's sermons, right? He'll quote stories and then connect them to God and explain them in that idea. But I wanted to just name that as part of what happens in all these texts. Let me pause there. Is this blowing up anybody's brain? And probably for the EFM people, this is old news, but if anybody else is worried about it, I wanted to name it.
Yeah, I mean, you're comparing it's to the culture sources that are similar and sort of to say to sort of name the theological aspects of it.
Absolutely.
Oral tradition was not copyrighted.
Nope. Well, written tradition wasn't copyrighted. Copyrighted
Written
didn't
tradition
exist.
wasn't copyrighted back then, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's some similarities to the Daniel story.
Yeah. There's lots. Oh, it's a thick book. It's not a thin book of those Old Testament parallels. And every time they put out an edition, a couple years later, they have to add another chapter or two because they find more parallels that they didn't realize were out there until somebody dug up another cuneiform tablet somewhere. So that's a little bit of a sidebar, but I just wanted to name it because it is within our story, right? So Brueggemann, and I think this is actually helpful, notes three distinct things about this story. One, we know, that is the reader or listener knows that Joseph carries the dream of God of Israel, right? We know that. The people within the story, the Egyptians, do not know that. Two, we know that Joseph is born to rule. And even that here in this moment, he does rule. He's given full authority of the household, right? But he's also born to rule more than just the household. We may not know exactly what, but we know it's a lot more. Three, that we know he's attractive in every way, right? So we know all three of these things. The crux of the story is the woman, the wife of Potiphar, who knows, doesn't know these things, right? So he turns around and looks at her and says, one, the woman lacks information. She doesn't know that Joseph carries that dream of God. Two, she has some information but misunderstands it. That is, she knows that she can tell that Joseph is smart and bright and accomplished and born to rule, but she doesn't realize that it's more than just her husband's home or homestead or his plantation or whatever you want to call it, right? And then three, she has correct info that he is attractive, but then chooses to exploit that. So in every single case, the woman gets something wrong, doesn't know it, misunderstands it, or seeks to exploit it, right? Joseph is beautiful, but he's not for sale. Even though they own him, he has his own integrity. So I think that's helpful to hear. It's just to help with the structure and why the story does, it's so brilliantly written, quite frankly. And then Brueggemann notes Joseph will concede nothing to the empire. The intimate maneuvering between the dream bearer and the woman embody the risky interaction of the faithful and empire. So Brueggemann has all these ideas that this is a resistance story, but then he can't. Maybe he just predates the whole idea of that resistance narrative, but this is absolutely what someone writing about a resistance narrative or resistance literature would be saying, right? That it's maybe about this woman locally, but it's this broader idea of this is what empires do. They exploit people, right? In any way they can. They own their body, mind, and soul, or at least they think they do. And he's so close, but he just doesn't quite get it. That is, every empire tries to exploit everyone, right? This is not a new story in time, past, present, or future. This story could be told of African-American husband or family member during plantation days or Jim Crow days, or even up to now. It could be the story of a migrant worker who's taking care of households or doing a variety of things. This is not a new story, right? That someone mistakenly thinks they own someone more than they do, or the empire and their status is higher, and therefore they can do whatever they want. And so the sex part is obviously referenced, but it's pretty much just one of 1,000 ways that the empire controls, demands, and owns the slave or the other in these situations, right? It's really, yes, that's the titillating part of the story, but it's obviously not the main thrust of the story because it doesn't happen. It's just another tool that she has to control Joseph, to own Joseph, to manipulate him in one way or another, right? But as a resistance narrative, again, it's not a new story. This is the regular, that Joseph prevails or at least keeps himself, is the new part or the different part, right? How does he maintain who he is or with the entire empire arrayed against him? That's what the example is. That's what the teaching is in this story, that he stays true to God. And he also recognizes, well, if I sleep with her, then I also run the risk of losing my position and 1,000 other things, right? He's stuck in an impossible position. So the only thing he can choose is to be true to himself. And again, when you talk about resistance literature, resistance narratives, it's to try to be much more empathetic and get into Joseph's shoes and say, what would you do in these situations, knowing that you're pretty much damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? That's what this story is ultimately about. He can't win either way. That is, if he does sleep with her, he loses what is different about him, his attention to fairness and to who God is and to who God has called him to a higher calling. He loses that identity. If he stays true to himself and refuses, which he does, then he is most likely going to lose his position and his power and his authority yet again and thrown into yet another pit, which is how it ends, right? But it's to still see that as the ways that empire controls people at all different levels of the economic ladder, right? This is how it works out. And people you don't have to be at the bottom of the ladder of empire for it to be in these situations, right?
But God is more powerful than the empire. But I guess we're coming to that, right?
You got it, boss. You got it. Yes. Which is perfect segue to Brueggemann there, Stefan. So the narrator offers an understanding of reality that is an alternative to every imperial presupposition of control. It was the premise of the wisdom teachers in Israel. They observed and understood not only that there is an abiding order to life, which no imperial ingenuity can ignore, but also that there is an inscrutable power for life at work in spite of every human cleverness devised. The text witnesses to the hidden life-giving power of God at work in the midst of imperial death. So good segue, Stefan. Yes, that we
I
can come
could
up.
help.
Yes, thank you. But yeah, so I mean, every time we come up with another way to control people or dominate them, God is with those on the other side of that control, right? Brueggemann loves to talk about it in terms of death, that there's this imperial death cult almost. I don't see it as much death cult as it is just power, but it ultimately leads to death, I suppose. It leads to the loss of self. So I guess to a certain degree, he's accurate. More symbolic death than literal death, but it is all of that, right? So on one hand, you have that life-giving power of God. On the other side, you have imperial death. He's trying to draw that juxtaposition of the two. So Brueggemann gets so close. He's right there, and he names it in a lot of ways. The formula of the Lord is with him may be royal in its origin, as the Davidic usage suggests, but it is then employed in a much more conflicted and tenuous life. And he actually, for reasons I don't understand, talks about Jeremiah. He goes through a whole series of things about how, well, that's how it's used with Jeremiah. I was like, or right here. I mean, I guess it's not literally the Lord is with him, but it says, over and over again, the Lord blessed him, the Lord is standing with him, the Lord is with him in all these different situations. And I'm like, wait, why did you jump ship at the middle of the great story here? And you had it's all lined up perfectly. And then he goes sort of sideways on it. But it is this idea, right, that the Lord is with those that are being crushed by power. And I think this is one that it is fascinating because Brueggemann's pointing out that when you look at different parts of the Bible, especially the Davidic sect, which is obviously then David becomes the imperial power, there's the real question of like, well, wait, who is the Lord with? If he is with David, can he also then be with, the lowest parts of the community in that situation too, right? I think you find out, yes, as Samuel reveals later and some others, but it takes a while for that to bubble up and come through. Again, God is the only chance against empire. Joseph would just be another piece of meat in the Egyptian grinder without God, right? If God's not on his side, he just gets thrown in prison. Or actually, here's the real thing that is not said in the text. I'm pretty sure if a slave is accused of sleeping with the master's wife, it's usually just death. There's not we'll throw him in prison and leave him down there. It's typically much more, it's lynchings, it's burnings, it's killing, because that's your property and they broke the rules, right? Than it is anything else. So it's already God is with him just to save him from being killed in this terrible circumstance. The fundamental question then of resistance narratives is, how do we survive? How do we survive when everything is stacked against us? How do we make it? How do we get through all of this, right? And if you listen to it that way, then God survives by being faithful to God in the face of empire, right? Because that's his ultimate answer is, it's not just that I shouldn't do it. It's not just that Potiphar gave me the authority for everything except for you, and I shouldn't be doing it with you. It's God would not approve, right? It's God would be against this. It would be sinful. It would be terrible to God is what he is holding true to in that context. Not just, well, I might lose my job. I might not be that way. So, and then God affirms that, right? Blessing Joseph every step along the way, finding ways to be with him. Thoughts on that interpretation? This is probably a different one than you were expecting us to go today, but it is an interesting kind of way of viewing this text that I think is actually more helpful, to be honest. In part because it makes more sense for this text and for Exodus and everything that comes after. But sorry, go ahead, Roy.
is Joseph fully aware of the master plan here by God?
Oh, I don't think, I think if you're talking about the character Joseph, he knows he's called to something better, that his brothers will ultimately serve him or bow down to him. But I don't think he knows that he's about to be number two to the Pharaoh. He has no
Right.
idea of that. I mean, I think he thought he was getting ahead and doing okay within the, sort of chipping away at the empire and getting a nice spot by working for Potiphar. But then it sort of goes to crap. And I think it's fair to say that he was pretty depressed being thrown into prison again, thrown into yet another pit. I
Okay.
mean, that's how I read it. Anybody could disagree, but I don't think that he would have any realistic expectation. Oh, it's okay. They threw me in jail, but I'm going to take over next week or next month.
But doesn't the dream say he didn't know?
Well, the dreams just are, I mean, they're dreams, right? A dream that says the brothers will bow down to you, and then I am the sun and the moon and all the stars bow down to me. So you have this idea of him being the best and in charge. But that's like any dream, like until you know the actual way it comes to truth. Maybe this is cool. And then sometimes a dream's just a dream and you go, uh-oh, maybe I got it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of this notion of it is not I, but the Holy Spirit within me.
Absolutely.
And, you know,
Joseph, we can say, well, I don't think, Roy, I think it'd be fair to say that Joseph doesn't know how it's going to happen. He definitely seems to cling to the idea, to that promise, though, that something good's going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
Something better is coming down the road. He doesn't know what or where, but he has a certain faith. And I think it's fair to say that he has a certain faith that something's going to happen down the road, but he doesn't know, have a certainty that it's going to be one thing or another.
Or anything about, right, anything about the specific things that will happen ultimately. He isn't aware of that.
I mean, I would put money if we had a conversation with Joseph when he was in Potiphar's house and in charge of everything. He was probably like, I'm doing pretty darn good. Maybe this is the promise that the whole rest of this household is bowing down to me. Maybe this is the promise, right? He might have thought it was done.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting take on faith and trust. What is faith? I mean, even what is believing? Believing is really not it's not a cognitive thing. It's an action of the heart. That's about trust, and we see that in Joseph.
Yeah, absolutely.
When he was sitting in prison, he might begin questioning what the intent was, but what God's plan is.
I imagine that's true for anybody in prison at any point.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But I think based on his faith, he always saw the silver lining.
Oh, Bill, we're not hearing you.
Oh, you're not? Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Now we are.
Yes.
Here you know.
Who knows? I don't know what you could or couldn't hear. Yeah, I agree, Stefan. I think he could have seen the silver lining and everything and been hopeful. At the same time, having a dark night of the soul or two locked in a prison wouldn't be surprising, even if you can see the silver lining, but sometimes those reversals hit hard enough. You go, what the heck? I thought I was doing okay.
Yeah, always the glass half full.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it gets back to the resistance narrative. I mean, this is speaking to people who are in tough circumstances, and that there is this this message hanging there.
Absolutely. So we aren't quite done with this. That is, a resistance narrative also shows how even the masters are powerless. This is, I think, some of the strength of those narratives. Potiphar is ultimately made a fool in his house by his wife, right? His wife is thwarted in her attempts and proves to be embarrassed because she can't get what she wants either. In resistance literature, the system makes everyone less, not just the oppressed. People who think they have all this power realize they can't even, turn on the lights in their house, or they don't have control over what's happening with their spouse, or they don't have, right? I mean, we can go down that long list of things that it turns out we need each other for, but empire lies to us and tells us, oh, we can do it all on our own, or we can make it all work by ourselves, right? And so that's a big part of how then they talk about resistance narrative, is not that it just dehumanizes those at the bottom of the rung, but it dehumanizes everyone in the whole system, right? The oppressor and the oppressed are equally caught in this system that doesn't help anyone involved, right? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, Potiphar's now out the guy who fixed everything and made it run well. His wife is now circumspect, at least in the eyes of her husband, right? I mean, there's all these things. The whole system has been broken, not just, the false claims against Joseph. The whole system is revealed as being inherently broken, right? That's where a lot of the resistance narrative stuff that I found especially helpful in when we talk about it, is to say, oh, this proves not just one side is powerless, but ultimately all sides are sort of caught in the same machine without even realizing it. They think they have power or authority, but oh wait, the wife really doesn't have as much power as she thought. Oh wait, Potiphar doesn't actually know how to run his house. Oh wait, the world, they're as high as they are, they're still not at the top, right? I mean, there's always someone with more power, more ability, everything. And so again, resistance narratives are subtle and critiques of the whole system, as well as telling the story of a specific person. I'll pause there for a quick second. Does that make sense? I mean, it does show it, but we don't always draw our attention to it. We're so busy sort of celebrating, which we should, celebrating the fact that Joseph has been pure and God is with him, and we know it's going to all work out. But if we skip the fact that Potiphar and his wife are being revealed to be powerless as well, then we're missing, I think, an important critique of the whole system. So I'm going to make it a little more relevant as well, just to connect it. One of my favorite books growing up was the Uncle Remus stories. The Song of the South was the movie, right, by Walt Disney. I don't know if y'all remember that show. I loved those books. I love those stories. It has now literally been banned by Disney. They have thrown away all the past copies and gotten rid of all kinds of stuff because it's deemed racist and offensive. You can't get it in the US. Evidently, there's some places you can, which I find even more fascinating. I think there's copies in Japan or something weird like that. And to be clear, it does show African Americans as slaves and foolish and simple. It is a racist depiction of African Americans. But it also missed that resistance narrative idea, because that's ultimately what those stories are about. It's because they're, for those who don't know the history, the Uncle Remus stories are a collection of slave narratives that were put into a series of books by a white author, and he created this sort of character of Uncle Remus and declared them to be Uncle Remus's stories, and then Uncle Remus tells them to other people. So he preserves the stories. He added this terrible sort of slave accent to him that he gives to the character, which again, that side is racist, but the stories themselves reveal resistance narrative in its purest form. It's literally stories that slaves told about the world around them and about these sort of reversals of situations, right? I love the stories of Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox and Brer Bear. because it's all this idea that here's this little rabbit who outwits the fox, who outwits the bear, those symbols of oppression and control, right? It doesn't take a real high degree in anything to see that this idea of the trickster and the reversal are all part of that same idea of resistance narrative, right? Is this idea that shows you can outthink empire and the system. If you're clever and you're wise, then you can do some of that work, right? It's not hard to understand that a theoretical man like Uncle Remus would delight in telling the stories than to white children, when the stories are really actually about them. But it's a way to tell them that without saying your parents are terrible or the system is broken and I'm being oppressed, right? It's a subtle way of revealing the inequalities and teaching it in ways that are accessible without it being offensive to the power structure, right? But he is ultimately undercounting that power structure and explaining how easy it is to outsmart and outmaneuver dumb ideas like Jim Crow laws or like all these other things that we all inherently know are unfair, but sometimes you have to tell metaphors and stories and have conversations that are indirect. It's actually how David, it's revealed, when he kills Bathsheba's husband, Samuel comes in and tells him a story in the same way, right? Like, a rich man is next door to a poor man and he kills the poor man and takes his sheep, right? And he's outraged. That's terrible. That's the worst thing ever. And it's like, well, you're the rich man who did it, right? I mean, it's that pure reversal that is the heart of this idea of resistance narrative and trickster narrative. That's all part of this, right? Sometimes it helps to sort of talk about more recent examples with these kinds of tales, right? And I'm not saying we need to go see the movie again, but it is about resisting empire and authority, and especially when it exploits and demeans and is all about right? And I love those stories. I still have the book, and I actually read it to Mose and Abe. The stories themselves, not all the stuff about Uncle Remus, but just here's the story of Brer Rabbit and Brer Bear and Brer Fox and how he outwits them, right? Because those stories of reversal appeal to kids because they too are powerless and they like the idea that you can outwit parents or adults or others, right? The deep part of the human psyche to sort of understand what it means to be crushed by something bigger or more complex and feeling little in the world.
I want to start singing Zippity Doo Dah, Bill.
I was just gonna say that the white guys at Disney don't like to admit that they made a bunch of money off of a movie of loosely of those stories, and did all the theming for the Splash Mountain ride at the Magic Kingdom.
Yeah, and they just now closed it, right? I mean, it's literally they just closed it like last year. Like, it's fascinating how they'll go, well, we're not going to make any more money on it, except for Splash Mountain.
except for Splash Mountain.
Except for these 12 other things, right? But yeah.
My grandkids love those stories. And so I got this, I bought a book a year or so ago, and it's a recollection of the Brer Rabbit stories, and it has a black author.
Oh, nice.
He's reformatted it and they're being told by a black elder to a young black man.
Oh, nice.
And it's like 300 pages. It's just one after another. And so, I mean, so every time my grandkids want me to bring books, I'll read it to them. And my grandson he was reading like 50 pages of it while I just sitting up in bed.
Yeah.
It's a great book.
What's it called, Lynn?
I can run around the corner and tell you just a second.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd be curious.
So you got to love how the Holy Spirit works sometimes. So I was writing all of this, getting it all done last night, and then this morning finishing up some stuff. And then today for the school's chapel for the upper school, they had Ambassador Young, come in to talk. And they had pre-prepared questions that some of the kids were asking Andrew Young. And the first question they asked him was, when did you start in the civil rights movement? When did you feel like you had a call to the civil rights movement in this whole process? And Andrew Young's response was, well, I was about 5 years old and I grew up in New Orleans, and my house was 2 blocks away from the head of the Nazi Party of Louisiana. And I learned early on how you had to negotiate and tell stories and work around that power. Right? Like from his early, he was like, from my earliest age, I learned how to speak in different ways and talk in different ways when I was next to literally the Nazi Party. Because he was born in 1932, and of course that was before everybody realized the Nazis were truly, truly awful. I think people had an idea, but didn't realize the extent. And so Young was like literally saying this, all of this, right? All this idea of resistance is completely true, that you have to have these ways where you deal with people. And they've, you know, he was a 5-year-old black kid in Louisiana, in New Orleans, who had no power and was going by a place that was outwardly hateful and willing to do anything they wanted to him. And he had to figure out ways to resist without losing himself, right? Ways to oppose that, but also avoid that at times, or figure out ways around it. And that's literally what he talked about this morning with the kids for a while, was how do you do that kind of work and realize that you got to change the system on a larger scale than just the local Nazi party on the corner. And you do that. His answer was, he told the story of Jesse Owens, and talked about how, you know, Jesse Owens chose to run the race to beat Hitler's master race, to show that Hitler was wrong, instead of protesting by not going, instead of protesting or like punching Hitler when he refused to give him the medal, or any of those other kinds of things. He chose to, and these are the exact words that Andrew Young used, outsmart Hitler by showing that he was better than Hitler, right? So that same kind of idea.
Brer Rabbit, hey, Bill?
Absolutely, right there.
The book is Uncle Remus, The Complete Tales, as told by Julius Lester.
Check that out.
It's like 300 pages. It's cool.
All right, so we'll do the last little bit here, which was, he was thrown in jail. Then the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. He put his favor in the eyes of the dungeon warden, and the dungeon warden put in Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the dungeon house. Whatever had to be done there, it was he that did it. In other words, Joseph goes to jail and is immediately put in charge of the jail. Shocking, huh? The dungeon warden did not need to see anything at all in his hands, since the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made succeed. All right, so the empire has its terrible way, throws him back in the pit. Again, I think he's actually saved in a lot of ways, because I do feel like if someone was accused of trying to rape the master's wife, they would not have been thrown into a pit. They would have been killed instantly, at least in a lot of the other systems. But Joseph makes it, and then he's put in charge. And yes, even in the pit, God is with him. That's how we know the empire is not going to make it, but Joseph is, right? And then they say, again, empire would say, oh, Joseph is a model prisoner. Look how wonderful he is. Resistance says, no, Joseph is blessed and has always been better than the empire, right? That's the fundamental difference between those two stories, right? The way we look at them, the way we read them, the lens through which we read them. That, oh, he goes along with the other prisoners and gets along well. Or Joseph has always known how to play the game better. Joseph has always known how to play it, and God's with him in the process. Here's my big thing. Why do I bring up resistance literature? Partly because this is the story. I truly believe that. But also, the more I read the stories of Jesus, the more I'm convinced that we need to start reading the Gospels that way too, as pure resistance literature, right? Jesus, after all, is part of a minority group within a minority group. That is, he's a group of people trying to reform Judaism that's already a minority group in his region, much less the entire Roman Empire. Of course, he is using all the tools of resistance literature to tell the stories that he wants to get out, right? You don't take on the empire directly, but you do it through stories or parables. You do it through comedy. You do it through reversals, right? Which is the heart of what Jesus' ministry is. And I think because we've gotten into a place, well, we've inherited the church and empire being the same, right? Thanks to Constantine, that idea of Christendom. We have tended to read a lot of these stories more in the empire side of stuff, instead of realizing that Jesus may be tweaking the nose of everyone in authority every single time we read one of his tales, right? And every bit the same way as Uncle Remus or any of the other folks. That Jesus is actually very subtly, but very clearly critiquing those in authority, whether they be Pharisees or Pilate or anyone in between, or us, right? Us who read the stories later and go, oh, I didn't get it the first 12 times I read it. So that's my thought. I'm off next week. I want to keep talking about it, but I was just going to turn off this side so we can just look at each other and for the rest of the conversation. Have spring break next week, so I'll miss y'all, and then I'll be back on March 16th with more fun. So, all that said, what do y'all think? I'm pushing resistance narrative hard, but I still think it works. Whether we're talking Brer Rabbit or Jesus or Joseph being thrown into prison.
Okay.
Interesting way to
really,
look at it.
I think it's an interesting way to look at it. That I mean, yeah, and I will start trying to consider the Gospels in that way, and also kind of think about with the different evangelists and how much they buy into that approach or not.
Well, I mean, I think it was when we did the Gospel of Mark, what sort of tweaked my interest in this was the Gospel of Mark, when he tells that one story to the Pharisees. You know, they get accused of picking bread or pulling up wheat, and they're like, you're not supposed to harvest wheat on the Sabbath. And then Jesus tells this story, but he gets it intentionally wrong. And only one critic that I've ever seen said maybe Jesus did that on purpose to make fun of the Pharisees. And again, if it's resistance literature, of course he did. Jesus very intentionally did that to go like, oh, it's like when Moses had the 15 commandments, right? And they all go, yeah, exactly, proving that the guys he's talking to are idiots, right? I mean, he's saying these ridiculous things on purpose to reveal the like lack of knowledge that they really have of what the scripture is, right? I mean, the whole point of the story then is not an actual lesson about whether or not you should be picking wheat on a Sunday, but he's trying to reveal that the Pharisees have no clue what they're even talking about, right? Which is a different way of hearing that story. And that's sort of what tripped me off to the whole conversation, where I was like, wait a second. This whole story, all these stories.
I always think of that story, the story of that Mark has of Jesus goes into the land of the Gerasenes, and you know, where he's basically, you know, tweaking the Romans.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's mocking the Roman legion and the pigs and all that kind of stuff, and you go, oh, right there on the surface, but we don't know all the context. But if that is the context, wow. But you can't say it directly. You have to make fun of it in that sort of sideways parable kind of stuff, right? Or that healing and miracle, and you go, oh, nice. Yeah. Well, and I mean, I just wonder sometimes, even especially as we head into the depths of Lent, into Holy Week, I'm gonna have to look at read John's, you know, story with Pilate again, right? Like, wait, what is he really doing with Pilate here? Is he just toying with Pilate, or what? Like, what's happening in that big narrative that we want it to be some big tete-a-tete, but maybe Jesus is just tweaking his nose the whole time at him?
I mean, Pilate says, you know, what is truth? It's like the empire is clueless.
Exactly. Exactly. Some people seem to call it apologetic, right? That he seems to be really light to Pilate and the empire. And I'm like, I don't think that's real light. If Pilate doesn't even know what truth is, or what is his whole job is justice, but he doesn't know how to do it. That's a pretty heavy critique, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good stuff, my friends. Well, anything else?
Where are you going for spring break?
We are going to Birmingham. We're going to show the boys where Jesse and I got married and where she grew up and all kinds of fun stuff like that. And visit her cousins and just have a couple of days away. Then I come back for the Wednesday night class with Ray. So.
Okay.
I'll be here.
Have fun, Bill.
Will do.
Hope
We'll
it goes
see y'all
well.
soon, my friends.
Okay,
Thank you.
And
Bye,
you.
everyone.
great to see you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.